Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about our papers. I wanted to dedicate whole class time for this and also look at one of those cases so you could have a good idea what to do, when to do it, how to do it, and so on. So the course paper is different because first of all it is much longer, it is 1,000 words. 1,000 words is roughly 4 pages, so it is about approximately double the size, and it also accordingly is 100 points, so that there's a sizable chunk of the grade, and that one is only due May 1st. Somewhat of a different idea. Course paper, like I said, longer, 1,000 words, also plus minus 10%, in this case between 900 and 1,100 is fine. You don't have to go over 1,100, but don't go over 1,100. I don't want the very long papers either, for several reasons. Why is long paper bad? Well, for one thing, you start rumbling. If you have too much stuff in there, if you stretch it too much, this is not good for the paper itself. For the other thing, I'm grading this stuff. I don't want them to be ginormous. I actually had students who submitted like 2,000-word essay, and that's like double word grading them. That's actually not good for me too. If everybody does that, I will have like so much to read. It's already a lot of papers. So 1,100 is the maximum. 900 on the other hand is the minimum because I mean you still need to at least have enough there for it to qualify. If you go over 1,100 or below 900, I will start deducting points for not having it appropriate length. And remember, just like with the short ones, that does not include any kind of cover page and does not include references and citations, well, unless they are in the text. So that stuff is, I'm going to exclude it. May 1st is the deadline, and the paper should highlight some sort of moral dilemma, right? Your example may be an actual one with the cases provided in case studies or in the readings, or you can find it anywhere else. You can imagine it yourself. You can take it from the movies, I don't know, The Matrix or any other movie you want. Anything is fine, but it should have a moral dilemma, and what you should do to this moral dilemma is, examples can be found online, science fiction, scholarly journals, charitable organizations such as Engineering Without Borders, so lots of different ways to find them. Organization. First, you should describe the example, focusing specifically on the moral nature of the case. Right? Obviously, we're talking about ethics, so it should be something which is connected to morality. Be sure to explain why the moral aspects of it matter more than any potential commercial value. So we shouldn't just think about it in terms of money or something, as is often the case. We should think of it from the moral standpoint, and then take the approaches. We didn't talk about those approaches yet, which is why the paper is only due in May, but we will talk over them. We'll go over Aristotle's virtue ethics. So you should take this position first and explain how virtue ethicists would view your example. Would he support it? Would he oppose it? What would he say about this specific moral situation? Explain the ideas, citations included, apply them to explain why Aristotle would view it this way. So as Aristotle says in this work, blah, 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 so I think that supports that he would say this about this specific issue. Then Kant. We will talk about Kant more. We talked about Kant already, but we didn't go into his moral theory, ethical theory. We will. We have the whole chapter on him, and you should second use Kantian view. How would Kantian view it? And again, try to support it with the original work from Kant. Then utilitarian. Utilitarianism we will start after next week. That's the first one actually. And for some reason in the book they are not in terms of historical timeline, but it doesn't really matter. Utilitarian, Mill. How would utilitarian look at it? Same thing. Apply utilitarianism and say whether utilitarianists such as Mill would approve of it, disagree. And finally, defend the moral recommendation you think, which one is the best. Right? So you presented them, now it's your turn. You have to say, I agree with Aristotle in this case. I think Aristotle makes the most sense. His ideas are closest to my heart, especially in this specific case. And this is why. Right? So that would be the conclusion where you have your own input. Concrete examples are hard to say. Depends on your area. I would stick to something which is of interest to you, obviously, and what you want to specialize in. I don't know if we got firefighters, but if somebody wants to be a firefighter, may want to think of something connected to fire safety, efficiency, emergency response, right? Healthcare, then something related to patient outcomes. And if you are not in some sort of professional sphere, then you can just take a general stuff from Plato or something and talk about them. Although I don't know how you would, well, actually if you take, Plato could be really applied to utilitarianism, to Kant, to almost anything, right? He has examples which later were worked with by these philosophers. So that could even work. I mean, now obviously Plato himself would not know this. He's been dead for a long time. But we can judge his works very well using anything. Okay, so now let's do a little bit of talk about Chernobyl. That's just one of the case studies. I hope you guys read it. Did you read it? Well, it's a little bit dry, right? It is more scientific in essence if you go through it. So what happened in Chernobyl? Accident on April 26, 1986. Just to connect it to reality, guess how old I was in 1986? I was almost 18 years old. So I remember it very, very well. Yeah, believe it or not, I'm 57. So I remember that day, I remember what happened, and I lived not that far. Well, I lived in St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg is maybe 1,000 miles away. So it's not dramatically far away, but it's the same country. So I actually kind of a live witness of the whole thing. But the scientific point of view, of course, is more complicated. So what actually happened there is they were simulating test. A test designed to access the reactor's safety margin in a particular set of circumstances had to be performed at less than full reactor power, scheduled to coincide with the routine shutdown of the reactor. And then what happened? Nuclear power stations not only produce electricity, but they also consume electricity. They use it for the operation. For example, the power that pumps to circulate the coolant. They need water to cool down those, what do they call them, where the nuclear reaction itself happens. So the electricity is supplied from the grid, but they were running the test. What if they don't have this electricity supply? What if something happens to it? If the source of electricity fails, most reactors are able to derive the required electricity from their own production. However, if the reactor is operating but not producing power, for example, when in the process of shutting down, some other source is required. Generators are generally used to supply required power, but there is a time delay where they are started. So the test carried out was designed to demonstrate that the coasting turbine would provide sufficient power to pump coolant through the reactor core while waiting for electricity from the diesel generators. That was the idea. circulation of coolant was expected to be sufficient to give reactor the adequate safety margin. Now, was it sufficient? Well, if you read, it turned out that actually it wasn't, and things went really, really badly. So just kind of we're not going to go through the entire thing, but kind of what they were trying to do. These rods, when they pull them out, the rods are meant to cool down the reactor. They kind of slow down the reaction, the nuclear reaction, right? So they pull them all down. But instead of them, they were using water. And water is pumped into the reactor and by itself meant to cool it down. Now, the unfortunate thing, as you probably find out if you read it, water does tend to turn into steam. And if it turns into steam, it no longer cools it down, it actually does the opposite. So this is exactly what happened. And they pulled out too many rods. When you put the rods back in, it turns out it also accelerates at first the reaction. They do eventually start working as a coolant, but at first they accelerated. And so without going into too many scientific details, the steam and the reaction worked in such a way that the whole thing has just exploded. And two explosions have occurred. One was a steam explosion. The other resulted from the expansion of the fuel vapor. The explosions lifted the pile cap. The whole thing has a cap, obviously, so that the nuclear stuff didn't come out and infect everything. But because there was an explosion, it kind of removed this cap. And as a result, that whole thing, the pieces of graphite, radioactive pieces of graphite and so on, started coming out, and there was also fire. As a result, 8 of the 140 tons of fuel, which contained plutonium and other highly radioactive materials, fission products, were ejected from the reactor along with a portion of the graphite moderator, which was also radioactive because it absorbs the radioactivity into itself. And these materials were scattered all around the site. In addition, cesium and iodine vapors were released both by the explosion and during the subsequent fire. Okay, so this is the picture, in case if you're curious how it looked like. This is the whole thing. It's one of the, I think they had 4 reactors. This is just one of them. The other ones were okay, but this one exploded. So they basically just blew everything, and the whole thing was scattered all over the place. And there was a fire on top of that. Now, this is the radiation spread. This is Europe, obviously. This is Chernobyl. The redder it is, the worse it is. So this area is the worst. Then it kind of gets better. In case if you're curious, I was right here. That's where St. Petersburg is. So it's kind of a distance, and it already is not as bad here, but still pretty bad. They didn't talk about it for the first few days. Then they started talking about it. Well, obviously, I was like 18 years old, so as you can imagine, we did not take it very seriously. We were just talking about it. And among the jokes, which I still remember, was, can you eat the apples from Chernobyl? Yes, you can, but the remainder has to be hidden deep inside the core. That basically is how we reacted to that. But it was pretty serious, especially since they got also a cloud of rain, which was kind of heading north. And at least according to the rumors, I don't know how true it is, they did shoot into it with those things which dispersed the clouds. And as a result, there was rain, and it really contaminated this whole area. But at least they didn't let it get into the more populated areas. Yeah, that was really, really bad. And the worst thing about radiation, it can actually resonate years and dozens of years later, right? It can cause cancer, and it did. I read a study about it. It's not in this specific reading, but I read a study that there's like huge number of, first of all, children with all sorts of deformities being born from the women who lived within the vicinity, and people who lived within the vicinity, especially this like red circle here, the darkest one, also have a much higher level of cancer, which manifests 10, 20, 30 years later. and so on. So this is pretty brutal, even if you at first don't notice it and think, everything's fine. Everything is not fine. That stuff is invisible, but it damages you. What happens is, remember we talked about it a little bit, the idea of nuclear reaction, any nuclear reaction, is that you have a nucleus which is surrounded by the huge number of electrons. In plutonium, I think they have like, what is it? 400 something. I don't remember what is the specific number, but so these electrons and neutrons shoot in all sorts of direction and then penetrate everything because they are invisible. They can penetrate your body, and it damages the cells. Once it damages the cell within your body, that becomes cancerous. And like I said, that can have an effect many years later. But even apart from that, the people who were there were immediately affected. Right? So let's look at some of the moral questions which are the most interesting for us. This is one. Do you think employees at the plant have moral obligation to sacrifice their own life while mitigating the consequences of disaster? Right? There were people who were working there. They knew very well what is going on. Once that thing exploded, it became danger to their life immediately. So what would be natural inclination of most people? Let's get the hell out of here. I don't want to sacrifice my life. I'm not ready to die yet. And they knew that stuff is like so bad that you can be miles away, it can affect you. But if you're right there next to this thing, every minute counts. You're really like bombarded with this radiation really badly. There were people, actually the first group who was the most affected were firemen. They had the local fire brigade, which normally would put down little fires, you know, like the house is burning or something. And they were called in there. The whole fire brigade came over. They didn't have special equipment. They got like water. And there's a fire and the chunks of radioactive material laying all around the place. It's actually, it's really bad. I shouldn't even smile when I talk about it because practically all of them died. Some of them died right there on the spot within a few hours because this is so much radiation. They started throwing up. The skin color turned red or something, and they died. After they died, they had to be buried in this special coffins because their body was radioactive forever. Right? So that's the moral question, right? Do they have the moral obligation? I mean, it's not really a job contract, strictly speaking. Even if you are a nuclear plant operator, do you need to sacrifice your life? And I mean, there's not really that much you can do. They were trying to do that. And by the way, I watched there's an HBO series called Chernobyl. I don't know, did you guys watch it? Those of you who watched it, what do you think about it? Okay, yeah, but did anybody else watch it? Okay, yeah, I can tell you what I thought when I watched it. The one thing which immediately kind of offended me, they made it sound like they forced these people to do it. For entertainment purposes, it's great, but they like had soldiers there with machine guns who was like, go and get it, otherwise I'll shoot you. Well, this is offensive to those people who sacrificed their life. They actually were not forced to do it. They were free to go. There were no soldiers. Actually, there are no soldiers at the nuclear power station. It's a civilian object. Why would there be soldiers? So they did it because they felt they had a moral obligation. They could run away. Worst case scenario, maybe they would go to jail. Trust me, it's better than dying from radiation. But they did it. They actually sacrificed their lives. And I think making it the way they made it in the series, like I said, while from entertaining point of view, it's great entertainment, but in reality, many things there, to me, who actually lived in the system and saw how it was all happening, was offensive. Like at one point, they were talking to this guy who's like an engineer or something, and the party boss told him, either you agree with me or we will throw you out of a helicopter. Oh, trust me, that would never happen. That's just, I don't even think it would happen in Nazi Germany, certainly not in a communist country. So anyway, but leaving that aside, that still is an important question, right? What would you do? Like most of us don't even think about it, but there may be a moment in our life when we can face similar situation. Are you obligated or not to sacrifice your life? It's easy to talk about it in a classroom when you have nothing dangerous at all, but this would be reality. You know, if you run away right now, you can't save your life. But if you stay, you're almost certainly going to die. Are you going to stay? And note that it's not like if you stay, millions will be saved. No, not really. You're just going to help with mitigating it a little bit. It still is exploded. There's still radiation out there. Millions are still going to die. You maybe save some people, even though it's again hard to say, depending on what exactly you're going to do. But it is your job, so you can do at least something. So that would be one interesting question for an essay, right? You can look at it from Kantian point of view. What would Kant say about it? What would Mill say about it from utilitarian point of view? What would Aristotle say about it from the virtue point of view? So that would be one of those questions you can look at. Another question is related to their families. And again, many people didn't realize this. Did those who had family have moral obligation to stay at the plant or prioritize safety of their family? There was a small city, Pripyat, which was actually where their families lived. And most of them had families. They had children. They had wives. So forget them. They were sacrificing their life. Not only that, they were sacrificing the life of their family. They knew it was dangerous, extremely dangerous for these people. So one way to react would be to go home immediately. Pick up your children, take them far away. Did they have an obligation to do it? What is the right thing to do in this situation? Do you prioritize your family? Most people would say yes, and some people actually did. There were a couple of people who got into the car immediately, drove off, took their family, and that's it. Nobody saw them anywhere near the area. Other people, at the very least, ran away to call their family, which also wasn't allowed at first, because they didn't want panic, right? And panic is a pretty bad thing. When people find out about something like this, they clearly, everybody could start running away, and they can hurt each other and so on. So that would be another interesting question to explore, right? This is the city. It's actually a picture of the city the way it is now, more or less. It's from 1921, I think, so a few years ago. Dead city. Everybody's gone. The city is still there, as you can see there. Plants growing and so on. There's some sort of a ferry wheel, which they were using back then. Pripyat was the most affected because it's like right there. The people from those buildings, and there's another thing in that in the HBO series, which also kind of, I found it a little weird. They had people from the city standing there looking at the explosion in the plant and just being entertained by it. Well, these are people whose family works at the plant. They know it's a nuclear plant. What do you think? How stupid do you think they are? They would see the explosion at the plant and they would go, oh, look at it. So nice looking. No, of course not. It was far enough not to be immediately seen. Plus, it was middle of the night. It's actually like 1 a.m. But when they find out, they were terrified too. And they would not be looking at it and having fun. That is obviously not what happened. But at the same time, how dangerous exactly it is, maybe they didn't realize at first. And what do you do with it? Because people have lives, right? They have jobs there. They have whatever commitments and so on. They have their property. I mean, if you live in that house, you have all your belongings in there. And do you even have another place to go? Until the government provides you some sort of way to escape, very few people would even do it. So another question we can ask about the government. Did the government officials have moral obligation to inform the population of the danger, given that there was no way to evacuate and the panic could have ensued? Because to evacuate it, it's a huge city. It's, I don't remember, it's not huge, but like 20,000 people or something. So it is big enough, you cannot just put it in a bus and have it shipped out. And if you tell people run away immediately, what do they do then? That could cause huge panic. There could be, like I said, problems with that. But what should government officials do? At the moment, for the first few days, they did nothing. And there are a lot of accusations about that because a lot of people think they should have at least immediately informed everybody and tell them what to do. Well, everybody was afraid. That indeed was a very centralized system. Nobody wanted to take initiative until a person on top tells them, and people on top did the same thing. And the person in charge of the whole country at the time was Gorbachev, and I don't think he even found out for a few days because they didn't want to immediately inform him about this horrible disaster. Once he found out, it took a while to decide what do they do. But the government officials do have an obligation to do something in a situation like this, right? What is their obligation? What is the right way to behave in a situation like this? By the way, one of the local officials just took his family, put it in a car, and drove off. So that was their reaction. Okay, at least I take care of my family. To hell with everybody else. Another interesting question to explore. This is another interesting picture. So former supermarket in Pripyat. That was picture taken on February 4th, 2020. Obviously, as you can see, it was left the way it is. The whole city is dead city. They just left everything. Eventually, they were evacuated. They were evacuated, it says here, 1 day after the plant reactor exploded. So not that late. Although there were people who lived further away, it took for them longer. Eventually, they created this whole dead area there. Now it is surrounded by like a fence, and you can't go there without permission. Part of the reason because people did go there without permission, and it still is radioactive, and they were even taking stuff out of there and bringing it to other parts of the country, and that obviously is not great. But there are also wild animals there, and some of them do migrate to other places, and the whole thing is a huge mess. It will take, I forgot how many thousands of years before it will finally become completely safe because of this half-life of the isotopes or whatever. So that is still very dangerous and radioactive. Not as bad as the first days, but still, even now, 40 years later, it still is. Okay, so how do you write the paper in general? Let's talk about strategies of writing the paper overall. Hopefully, some of it you did get from English 101 and 102, but like I said, let's not take it for granted. So the usual structure of the paper is first you start with the introduction of the topic, including your thesis, which typically is like at the end of the introduction, right? What would be a thesis? Well, you can answer one of these questions in some sort of a positive way. You can say employers did or did not have a moral obligation to stay at the plant. That's what I think. Then body of the text. This is where you would bring those different philosophers and you would say what Aristotle would say about it, what Kant would say about it, what Mill would say about it, and whether you agree with them or not. And finally, you summarize. This is the conclusion usually. What you have discussed briefly, just repeat briefly. I presented this and that, and this is what I concluded based on this. Obviously, when you talk again about Kant and about Mill and so on, you do want to have at least some quotes there, because the best way to support it is with the original material. Yeah?
This is for the course paper, not
yeah. Well, the short paper should be a miniature version of that, except you don't need to bring all those Mill and Kant. You just talk about concepts, right? But the idea is still the same. The basic structure is still the same. You start with the introduction, then the body of the text, then the conclusion. Any paper should have these elements. If it's not, if it's just the mix of words and ideas, that's not a well-written paper. How do you typically write a paper? Just my own experience of writing it. And well, I may as well talk about it now, I guess. I wrote so many papers. I went to Oxford. In Oxford, the way students are taught, you have a weekly paper. Every week you have to write a paper of 2,000 words. They give you a list of literature, which typically is 15 books, and 1 week. And you have to come up with a paper. Now, can you read 15 books in 1 week? No, you cannot read 15 books, but there's a shortcut. You read the introduction and the conclusion for every book. You get an idea what it's about. Maybe one book you read in its entirety if you really like it. And then you come up with this paper. And you do it, well, they have 3 terms, 10 weeks each, so you write 30 papers basically in a year. And the only grade you get at the end of this whole thing is you have to write an exam. You have to write a paper in the exam entirely from your own head. So you basically just given 3 questions, 10 questions. You can choose any 3 of them, and you write 3 papers back to back with the pen on the paper. You have 3 hours for this. Right? So you base it on the papers you have written before, but the questions are a little bit different. And you have to just literally reproduce 3 papers. Introduction, body, everything. No computer, nothing, just your pen. So, and that grade for this exam is the only grade which goes into your transcript. All the other grades are for your information only. They don't go anywhere. You write these papers, they tell you, okay, it's 60% or something. That doesn't mean. By the way, the scale there is very different. 50% is a passing grade, 60% is like a B, 70% is an A. And students always ask, well, 70%, why so low? Well, you measure it against all the great people who were there before you, if Stephen Hawking got 83%, who are you to get more than that? So that's basically the idea. Nobody ever gets 100. That's another interesting thing. And you would think, well, at least in math, you should be able to get 100, right? If you did everything right. But here's what they do. They don't give you enough time. The time for the exam is measured in such a way that if you do every exercise within this time, you do it so quickly that you have no possibility of possibly avoiding mistakes. It's just not humanly possible. But if you take your time, you will not complete it. You will not do all the exercises. So it's which one do you choose? You cannot have both. And as a result, you will never get 100%. It's just impossible. You have to be some sort of AI genius or something. I don't know. Anyway, but back to the paper. So how do you do that if you only have 1 week? Well, the strategy typically is to start with anything. You just put whatever you want. Just if any idea you have, just start it. You have to start it. Usually I did it on the second day. Not on the first, but on the second, I read a couple of introductions, have a little bit of ideas. I'll write maybe 20 words, whatever. Then I read more. Then I add. Then I reread whatever nonsense I have written, and it's usually nonsense. And I will kind of remove some stuff, add some stuff. That's like day 3, right? Then I read some more. Then I do more of this. And then I have already a little bit of a kind of a paper, but not quite a paper yet. And then you revise it again. And then you reread it and you leave it for another day. You revise it again. This is the only way to write. Every time you reread it, and you have to reread it, by the way. That's another thing. Before you submit it, especially, always reread your paper. You will immediately find so many horrible things. I read papers students leave like fraction of a sentence, words which make no sense. You would immediately notice it if you read it. If you read it at least once before you submit it, you will immediately see, okay, that doesn't make any sense. But the more you reread in it, the better. Because you reread it, you notice some stuff, you changed it, That already changed your paper a little bit. If you reread it again, you will notice more stuff. And that is the constant process until the deadline. When the deadline comes, then you actually have to submit something. So obviously, you reread it one last time, and then after that, that's it. But this is the way to write the paper. This is the proper way to write the paper. That way, your paper will be the good one. If your approach is to wait until the last day and then try to use AI or something to come up with a paper, that will be nonsense. And by the way, I will create an assignment. It's like an assignment on Web Campus. You need to submit this paper through that specific link, and it's checked for AI. So it will tell me the percentage, probabilities, and so on. And if they are too high, you will have a problem, because obviously you cannot use AI. We're not learning how to use AI in this class. We're learning ethics, and AI, I'm sure, can already write pretty good papers, but I have no interest of grading them, reading them, wasting my time, because I don't work for AI. So that would be a waste of my time and waste of your time. Use it. Don't use it. Use your own brain. Okay, in terms of citations, so you do need to provide citations, but any style is fine. I'm not going to require you like a use specific style. Whichever one you feel comfortable with is okay, as long as it's consistent, right? So any way you want it, any way you learned, I'm sure you learned some way in like your English classes, just use that, and that is fine by me. The 4 essays should be different so that you use different examples and different topics for each of them. Obviously, you don't want to repeat the same exact stuff over in a different paper. And yeah, so that's the part when I tell you submit them on Canvas, Web Campus, whatever they call it, in Word format only. Do not do it on PDF document. A couple of students did it for some strange reason. It's impossible to work with PDF document. It has to be Word. I don't even know, like, you can't write it in PDF. Why would you turn it into PDF? Don't do that.